Good morning, gentlemen and gentlewomen. Today is Tuesday. You are getting your reset in NA right now. You are getting your Sepulchre raid week available in NA and tomorrow in EU. So yesterday, when I was checking some data and some numbers for the raid video on Warcraft logs, I stumbled once again on the announcement from Warcraft logs about how they were going to experiment on the external buffs in Season 4, removing logs of players who received too many externals, and this of course was the issue with Power Infusion. So it came to me that since that announcement we have gotten even more specs and talent trees in Dragonflight. We have gotten Mage, we have gotten Warrior, we have gotten Paladin, we have gotten Warlock. So since then, I figured we are now getting almost to the end of all of the classes on Dragonflight talent trees so far. We see what the specs can bring to a party or to a raid, which brings me back to the question of Power Infusion. This thing right here, Power Infusion, is at its best, you know, in organized group content, namely Mythic Plus and Progress raiding, is going to be the best place to find Power Infusion. This ability has started to create quite a few frustrations as time went on. You know, giving away Power Infusion can cause frustration to the priest itself, because it's fun to be under the effect of Power Infusion, but, you know, as a priest, you don't often get to use it. You almost never get to use it as a healer, and very rarely you're gonna get to use it on yourself as a Shadow Priest in an organized raid setting, haste being very important for other specs in the game over Shadow Priest. The main problem that players have lamented of Power Infusion is the balance, the class balance woes that this can cause. Looking at the Power Infusion values, you have specs like Demolock, you have specs like Fire Mage that can gain even more than 10% of a damage increase when they receive Power Infusion, while, for example, something that doesn't have as big of a burst window like an Elemental Shaman only gains 4% damage increase. There is, of course, a difference in power on which character can gain the most from Power Infusion. And this can warp your idea of an entire class or spec. We talked just yesterday about how if Demonology Warlocks were not being given Power Infusion in the raids, they would be far below where they are now in the rankings. Demonology Warlock wouldn't be, in fact, considered one of the strongest specs right now if they weren't the main target, the main recipients of Power Infusion. The same can be said for Fire Mage. Fire Mage, which has been rising in the ranks in these last couple of weeks of the raid, they are also the second most used target for receiving Power Infusion together with Demonology Warlock. So this can also warp your entire idea, your entire notion of which spec is strong. You know, what if all of a sudden all of the priests of the world decided to stop giving Power Infusion to Demonology and Power Infusion to Fire Mage, and they started giving Power Infusion to Frost Death Knights and to Enhancement Shamans? Would this drastically change how players see the specs in how powerful they can be, with Power Infusion changing its target? This type of discussion, of course, started revving up again once we got the news about 3 weeks ago of the Priest Talent 3 for Dragonflight, which, of course, had Power Infusion in it. Not just any tree, but the general tree of priests. So all priests, just like right now, will have access to Power Infusion in Dragonflight. Now, this lessens the problem for Shadow Priest, because Twins of the Sun Priestess, the current Shadowlands legendary, will be available as a talent in Dragonflight, so priests themselves will still get their Power Infusion buff. Now, that being said, even if you solve the if question, if a priest gives Power Infusion to someone else, this talent will now fix it. However, you will still have the when question, because of course a holy priest might not want to use Power Infusion when the Demonology Warlock is using Power Infusion, except you will have to decide, because once you give it to the Demolock you will also gain it on yourself, but perhaps it's gonna be completely useless on yourself at that moment. So yes, you can now duplicate Power Infusion, but very likely, very often, it's not really gonna be that big of a benefit for the priest healers that will have to give Power Infusion away to someone else. Then, because of what we saw in the talent trees of Dragonflight, we might even have more problems than just this issue of Power Infusion, because we have seen more and more party buffs being introduced in Dragonflight. So, for example, you have the Fire Mage activating Combustion, giving crit chance to its party members. You have the Restless Crew talent to empower Restless Blades to also work with cooldown reduction to your party members. We have also seen that, for example, Paladin, Holy Paladin, is now going to have the Blessing of Seasons Covenant ability for Night Fae added to its talent tree, which is another external buff you will be able to give out. So this might incentivize stacking buffs even more. You know, you can get Restless Crew to reduce your CD, you can get the Blessing of Seasons with the extra damage, or the CDR to make your big cooldown have an even shorter cooldown, and then buff it up with Power Infusion. So it might even make the big buff of Power Infusion even worse. You could go the same way with Power Infusion. You could make it less of a problem by turning it into a party-wide buff. So a haste buff to the whole party, of course, at a much limited rate, instead of 25%, something smaller. So it will benefit more targets, there will be less competition and less complaints, because more players will be able to gain the buff. It's gonna take pressure away from the priest in having to choose the target every time, reducing the risk of potential balance problems by having these massive cooldown specs like Demonology or Fire Mage always being the recipients of Power Infusion, because Power Infusion is short, which means you want a short window with lots of damage, which means only the burst classes will ever gain Power Infusion. You will never see specs like Elemental Shaman, for example. You will never see specs like Frost Mage, for example, be the recipients of Power Infusion, because they have no burst, because their damage profile is very continuous. Meanwhile, specs with lots of burst, like Fire Mage, like Demolock, like Affliction Warlock, even in its new Dragonflight build, or Unholy Death Knight, they are specs with much bigger burst, which can benefit more from Power Infusion. So spreading the buff to be a party buff might fix some of the issues, some of the problems. Another possible change, another possible fix is to change the buff of Power Infusion to be a damage buff. Because at the moment Power Infusion is a haste buff, which is much different than damage. You know, haste, for number one, haste is much more difficult to calculate in terms of what does it give you, because haste makes you attack faster, it makes you cast faster, for certain specs it reduces the cooldown of your abilities, it makes your dots tick faster. Meanwhile, if that 25% haste increase was turned into a 20% more damage done, it would be much more simple to calculate how much power you gain from Power Infusion. You could also remove the damage increase from logs. You could remove the damage increase from even from details from your damage meter in game. It would be much easier to essentially to isolate, to take to the side and pretend it doesn't exist, as opposed to the current haste buff, which is basically impossible to just detach, to just take away from the total damage that the player has done. It would also be much simpler to balance in Blizzard's end, because haste scaling can create lots of balancing problems over just damage increase. Haste, as I said, increasing the cooldown reduction of your abilities, making you cast faster, it can create multiple problems, whereas a 20% damage increase is just flat out more damage, it's much more simple to handle. So these could be some fixes that would make the issue with Power Infusion more simple to handle when it comes to the balancing. Of course, we have already seen the announcement, the statement from Blizzard about Power Infusion. They said, well, you know what? There are two games being played in a raid group. There is game one, which is the game that we are building, which is beat the raid boss. Defeat the boss or clear the dungeon within the time limit. That's it, job done. But then there is also game two, which is something that the players have created for themselves, which is to win the DPS meters. The statement from Blizzard was, we are focusing on game one. We are thinking about balancing the game around defeating the bosses, and then you, community, can then think later about logs, about meters, about rankings and all that stuff. We're going to let that entire thing be shaped by the community. We're not going to think about it too much. So Blizzard was already putting their hands ahead of themselves by saying that we want none of this, we don't want to hear any of this, just deal with it amongst yourselves. We are leaving Power Infusion as it is for now, and we're gonna let you deal with the issue of damage meters and whatnot. Obviously, despite the statement from Blizzard, players would still be complaining, because at the end of the day, parsing, essentially seeing how much damage you did in comparison to others, is a part of the game that many players look forward. every tier. Just seeing how powerful your spec is, how can your spec compare to other specs, and then how well you can perform on that spec is something that many, if not most, DPS players enjoy partaking in. Power Infusion makes that part of the game something that players who aren't receiving the buff cannot partake in, because you effectively cannot win against someone who receives Power Infusion. You just can't. Of course you can if that player is terrible, but assuming you are of even skill, assuming you are equally good players, then you simply cannot win. You simply have to just accept that you're not going to be doing the same damage because of an external buff that is beyond your control. You might be able to execute a near perfect rotation on an encounter, you might have dodged and dealt with all the mechanics perfectly. At the end of the day, a player who got hit by a bunch of mechanics and fucked up a few other things, if he got Power Infusion, then he's still gonna beat you. So this is what has kept players being a little bit annoyed at the existence of Power Infusion. I always considered Power Infusion as a comparison because this is something that annoyed me a lot back in Legion. Since right now I am a healer and perhaps I can't quite understand the perspective of DPS players being annoyed by not being in the conversation for Power Infusion. Something similar could be Legion Legendaries. Legion Legendaries were completely RNG for the first part of the expansion, and you had essentially no say in which legendary you were going to receive. One legendary could have been a completely useless 0 damage increase, and then another legendary could be a 10% damage increase best in slot legendary. What happens when you enter the raid as a rogue with a no damage legendary, and then your fellow rogue raid member has the best in slot legendary, means that no matter what you do, no matter how well you perform, because of external reasons of RNG, that rogue player is going to do 10% more damage than you, because he was more lucky than you and got a better legendary. This is pretty much how I compare the existence of Power Infusion. Power Infusion is an external entity that you have no control over. In this case, the RNG is your raid leader who decides who gets the buff, or perhaps Blizzard who balances the specs, which then makes players decide who gets Power Infusion, and because of that you will be doing 10% less damage than someone else, purely because of that fact. That's how I often compare the Power Infusion in terms of perhaps how DPS might feel, how DPS players might feel when they don't have access to Power Infusion over other players. The other issue with Power Infusion is that, of course, it is completely tuned around certain specs. So the moment the patch is out, the moment the tier is out, simulations are out, the top players have run their numbers, have figured out who of the specs in Dragonflight has the strongest burst, who of the specs in Dragonflight has the most benefit from high haste. Once that moment happens, that is who is going to receive Power Infusion for all of the 4, 5, 6 months of the patch, until something changes in the next patch. If nothing changes in the next patch, that target, that class and spec will continue to receive Power Infusion for the entirety of the game. There isn't even a niche to this, there isn't even a variety to this. It's not like, oh, the fight is single target, Power Infusion goes to the Warlocks. Oh, the fight now is AoE, Power Infusion goes to the Mages. Oh, the fight has tons of healing, Power Infusion goes to the Priest Healers. It's not even like that at the moment. At the moment, you pick the spec with the strongest burst, with the most benefit from haste, which at the moment is Demonology Warlock, and that's the spec who receives Power Infusion forever. So that is also perhaps making some specs lose some hope, getting a little bit defeated, because they really don't see any room in which they might eventually be the recipients of the Power Infusion buff. Now, the conclusion to this issue is that, of course, not many players are too worried about this. Every time we talk about Power Infusion, there's also going to be quite the vocal side of the community, which is like, dude, who cares? You know, I don't really mind about Power Infusion. I don't really have an issue with Power Infusion. Let the priest choose whoever, you know, it's not really an issue. Of course, someone who only does LFR and normal raiding, or likes to do transmog runs in all their dungeons, doesn't really care about Power Infusion, and his solution is leave it as it is. That's because it doesn't concern him. It doesn't really touch his gameplay. It doesn't make his gameplay worse or his experience in the game worse. It's as if a certain spec becomes SSS plus tier in PvP because of a certain legendary, and then players start complaining that the spec is just broken OP in PvP. And then you get a horde of PvE players saying, this legendary is just fine, it's not really an issue, why are you complaining? Well, that's because it's not concerning you. That's because the issue of that legendary is purely in PvP, which is where it should be fixed in. So that has been my stance on Power Infusion so far. Even as a healer which doesn't really expect to gain Power Infusion and doesn't really benefit too much from Power Infusion anyways, I still don't like this ability. The drama it creates, and also ruining a little bit the competitiveness of the healthy competition between specs in having good DPS gets sort of ruined by the existence of Power Infusion. You know, when you're progressing on the Jailer and you have to go to kill rank 724 to find the first Demonology Warlock without a Power Infusion, you know, why? If Power Infusion is an ability that exists for priests to use on a Demonology Warlock every single time, then why does it exist? If it's one buff to be given to a single spec at all times, no matter what, no matter where, then why does it exist? What's the purpose of an ability like that? If you can't find a way to turn Power Infusion into an ability that can be used to benefit different specs in different ways, so you have room to choose different targets in different situations, in different environments, if that doesn't happen and you always end up using PI on the same target every single time, then you might as well not have it in the game. Or at the very least change it, as the examples we made here, like change it to a party buff, change the haste buff of Power Infusion into a damage buff, change it in some way that can make it a little bit more varied on who can benefit from Power Infusion. That is my take so far on this cursed ability of priests, which has resurfaced in the Dragonflight talent trees as part of the next expansion. So I thought some more discussion about the ability was warranted, because I fear this debate will continue to drag on until Dragonflight is out. So let me guys know what you think about this ability, especially of course if you run Mythic Plus keys or raid environments where you do see the power, the influence of Power Infusion in full effect, especially from perhaps even from Warlock mains who have benefited from Power Infusion for a long time. How do they feel about this ability? Or maybe even the bitter and salty other spec players who have not benefited from Power Infusion basically ever. Just let me know how you feel about this ability staying in the game, getting removed from the game, getting changed in any way. Let me know. With this being said, it is now time to leave on this Tuesday. Thank you, of course, as usual, to all of my patrons for supporting me. You are a good help in what allows me to continue to produce content for all of you guys. And as we get deeper in the Dragonflight Alpha and eventually in the Beta, of which, as usual, I am the CEO, chairman, and representative of the No Alpha company. Eventually, one day, we will get into the Beta, we will get more content to dish out. Eventually, we will also start streaming some of the beta for all of the stuff that will have to come, like testing out specs, rotations, sims, and the DPS of specs, trying to gauge which will be the new meta of Dragonflight, etc, etc. That will be very fun to go over. You can also, for further support, like and comment down below, as I said, about your feelings about Power Infusion, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. To finish the list of social simping, you can follow me on Twitter right over here. Come on guys, there is tons of people watching these videos. You should just go and spend like 30 seconds to click follow. Eventually it's gonna be enough that I can start to open my own OnlyFans account with all of the clout I have on Twitter, for sure. And then you can also, of course, support me by subscribing to my Patreon. With this being said, it is now time to leave. As usual, the video has gotten much longer than it was supposed to be, but I have now given up trying to be short in these type of discussions. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I love it. I love it when I'm told, oh yeah, we're going out this afternoon and we will be back by 4 p.m. and it's now 7:20 p.m. and those hacks are still not back. Oh my god, the timing.